Willful blindness really starts out as a legal concept. And I won't bore you with legal concepts all evening, I promise. But the legal concept of willful blindness states that if there are things that you could know and you should know, but you somehow manage not to know, you're still responsible. It's most often used in drug trafficking cases or money laundering cases. So if I give you a suitcase and say, when you're going to France, could you take this with you? And you don't open it up and it turns out to be full of drugs or money or guns, you're responsible. You could have known and you should have known, and the fact that you didn't know, well, that's your fault. So I first encountered this idea when I was writing 2 plays for the BBC about Enron. And when Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay, the CEO and chairman of Enron respectively, were on trial, the judge in that case instructed the jury about willful blindness. And as I was reading that transcript, I thought, as I was reading the transcript, the banks were collapsing. So I had this extraordinarily surreal experience that all day I'd be caught up in this enormous historical catastrophe. And then I'd go home and put on the radio and discover that I was caught up in a real-life historical catastrophe. And I thought, this is really unpleasant, and it's kind of odd. Because everybody was saying, well, wow, we really didn't see this coming. And I thought, hang on a second. And suddenly the whole concept of willful blindness sort of seemed to make sense of all the chaos I was seeing around me. I thought, you could have known, and you should have known, and how come you didn't know? Because we didn't have to be in this mess. And so then I started thinking, because I guess this is just the sort of insane way my mind works, I started thinking about all sorts of other things where this was the case. So it was banks, it was Lehman Brothers. They couldn't know how much debt exposure they had. I thought about Google. Everybody holds up Google as like this perfect company. Well, Google missed social networking. That's kind of a big oversight. You can be pretty sure that half the Google employees were on Facebook every day, but it somehow never quite dawned on them this might be quite an important thing. And I think what's really interesting about the Google case is you can't say, oh, well, it was stupid people, right? Because Google's full of, all these brainiacs. So I thought, okay, so that's interesting. So now you have a lot of smart people who aren't obviously unethical still making gigantic mistakes. And then that reminded me that Microsoft very famously missed the internet, right? Just down the road, people were building Netscape, and all the engineers in Microsoft failed to notice that. So I thought there's a really interesting pattern going on here. And then I was talking to some people in the packaged good industry, and they said, well, actually, I was working at Pepsi for years, and I kept trying to explain that in Europe, everybody drinks bottled water. And everybody in Pepsi said, oh, come on, don't be stupid. Nobody's going to pay $1 for a plastic bottle of water. So for years and years and years, a company full of really smart, innovative, creative individuals completely missed a gigantic, important, and profitable trend. And while they were missing that one, they were also missing this one, which is they completely failed to notice that with a lot of people who want to be healthy but not do very much, very active to be healthy, things like this were constituting a gigantic, gigantic new market. So I kind of put all these things together and thought, okay, so what does this tell us? What it tells us is you can be really smart, really connected, really well informed, and still miss extraordinarily obvious things. I wonder why that happens. I wonder how it happens. And if I understood that, could I see better? And that was really the mission I set off on when I started researching and writing the book that subsequently became Willful Blindness. Now, what I want to do to kind of set the scene is to give us a frame of reference that we can all share a little bit. So I'm going to show you a very short film, which I think kind of exemplifies many, many aspects if you like, with the willful blindness thesis, and which also, I hope, reinforces, if you haven't got the message yet, that missing obvious things is incredibly costly in terms of opportunities and damage, and it creates huge amounts of pain and suffering. So I think it's a very fundamental issue in business today. On March 23, 2005, Warren Briggs got into his car and set off for work. The commute to the BP refinery in Texas City usually took 30 to 45 minutes, but that day it felt longer. When he got to the plant just before 6 a.m., he could scarcely remember driving there. Warren had been working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, for 29 days in a row. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had time off. He spoke briefly to the departing night shift operator and then read the logbook to prepare for the startup. In front of him sat the control board for the ISOM NDU AU2 complex, 12 monitors divided into 24 screens. Some screens had pages and pages of information behind them, others were pretty simple alarms. "We're running so thin." That was the phrase everybody used. At first it just meant the pipes were wearing thin, but now the whole place was wearing out, the plant and the people. With no one to relieve him, Warren ate his lunch at his desk in front of the control board. Some weird pressure spikes caught his attention, and he wanted to keep an eye on them. The equipment he was supposed to be controlling stood outside in the Texas sunshine, one small part of the vast refinery. When people first saw it, they'd say it looked like something on the moon, a space-age settlement full of towers and spheres that went on for miles. Warren didn't share their romance. It was just a refinery, making 3% of America's gasoline. That was a lot of cars. Starting the unit was always a tricky time, when it would have been nice to have an extra pair of eyes. In the old days, there had been 2 operators, but cost-cutting had changed all that. Then they'd added a 3rd unit, the NDU, and said it was so easy to operate you didn't need an extra person. So instead of 2 people for 2 refinery units, now it was just Warren on his own, looking after all 3. At 1:14 p.m., 3 emergency valves opened in the tower, sending nearly 52,000 gallons of hot, flammable liquid to the blowdown drum. When the liquid overflowed into a process sewer, it set off alarms in the control room, but the high-level alarm didn't go off. While Warren sat in front of his 24 screens, a geyser of liquid and vapor erupted from the top of the stack, propelling nearly a tanker full of hot gasoline up into the air and then down to the ground like a tall, ungainly fountain. Within 90 seconds, the whole unit and all the contractors' trailers were engulfed in a vast, flammable vapor cloud. Then a nearby car backfired.
911.
A mile away, Joe Belancich was negotiating for a new apprentice scheme. He felt one concussion in the room, then another. Everybody moved to the window. Flames and smoke filled their view while pieces of pipe and metal rained down on the ground. 45 minutes from the site, Eva Rowe heard the blast. Both her parents worked at the site. She called them at once. No answer.
Trailer on fire. Was he going in? Got fire. It's the ISOM. Oh, tell me get some water over here on the north side of this trailer.
The explosion at Texas City was the worst industrial accident in America's history until the Deepwater Horizon. And the thing that's interesting about it is it's an absolutely textbook industrial accident. Because what's true is that you can see quite literally years of warning signs that something bad is going to happen. In the 5 years leading up to it, a couple of people die at this refinery every year. Lots of weak signals. Lots of consultants' reports talking about the impact of cost cutting, talking about the impact of huge executive reshuffles all the time, to the point that you have an employee quoted in one of these reports saying, Every day when I drive into work, I wonder if today is the day I'm going to die. What you absolutely cannot say about Texas City is, oh my goodness, nobody saw this coming. Everybody saw it coming. But there are all sorts of other characteristics to this accident. And the reason I tell the story is because I like anchoring it in kind of real life. So let's think for a second about poor Warren Briggs, one of the very few people to lose his job after this accident, and think about what he's trying to do. So Warren Briggs is on his 30th 12-hour day. He hasn't had any time off, and the Chemical Standards Safety Board estimated that he had a sleep debt of approximately a month and a half. Now, you and I would know that what that does is it leaves him feeling pretty lousy. But actually, what it does is much more interesting than that. Because I always sort of assumed, as a workaholic, that if you get tired, well, it just means your work isn't quite as sharp. But actually, it's much more interesting. As your brain gets tired, and as it's sleep deprived, its primary drive is to stay awake. So the part of your brain responsible for staying awake starts to siphon off energy from the other part of your brain that's responsible for critical thinking. So the glucose that should go through your thinking part of your brain goes to the awakeness part of your brain. Now, if you think about this from the perspective of evolutionary biology, it makes perfect sense, right? You're walking through the jungle, a tiger jumps on you. Much more important to be awake than to be able to figure out exactly what kind of tiger it is. The problem is, of course, that Warren really needs his critical thinking capabilities. He really needs to be able to look at these pressure spikes and not just think, how do I get rid of them, but to think, what's causing them? Why are they there? Is it dangerous? How can I deal with the source of the problem, rather than how can I just make the problem apparently go away? So the very fact that Warren is so tired means that he actually can't quite see what's happening in front of his eyes. So that's a problem. Furthermore, he has these 24 screens. And if you take anything away from this evening, I hope it's this, which is the brain can't take this in. In fact, it doesn't even have to be that complicated. The next time you're at home watching CNN, and there's stock prices and news headlines and weather forecasts going all over your screen, and some poor idiot stuck in the middle trying to say something intelligent, ask yourself how much of that you actually took in. And I've tested this on students. And the first thing is, they take in almost nothing. And the second thing is, they are definitely not thinking critically about any of it. It is so hard to absorb all of this information. You have no capacity left to ask fundamental questions like, do I believe what this man is telling us? Do I agree with his data? Do I know where it comes from? Do I understand what bias or perspective he may be offering? Now, there's some people who would say that's what all that noisiness is about, is to get us to accept it uncritically. But the neurological evidence is you simply cannot do it. The brain doesn't multitask. It will task switch, and it will switch between tasks very, very quickly, faster than you can think of consciously. But of course, each time it's switching, there's a gap, and you could call that gap a blind spot. So if Warren is looking at one screen, he's not looking at 23 others. And he may be looking at them all frequently, but he simply can't take in the amount of data that he's being asked to process. Now, there's a very, very famous experiment done by an absolutely delightful guy named Dan Simons, and I'm going to spoil it for you, so I'm not going to play the whole film. But it's like all the best psychology experiments. It's just incredibly funny. So essentially what he did is he got a whole bunch of his students to wear black T-shirts or white T-shirts and to pass this basketball back and forth between them. And he asked people watching this to count who did the largest number of passes. Was it the team in the black T-shirt or the team in the white T-shirts? And of course, you know, because he's teaching at a university full of people who want to do things really well, they focused very intently on this, with the result that at least 3/4 of them will fail to notice that in the middle of the video, for fully 9 seconds, is a 6-foot-tall woman dressed in a gorilla suit. And what Dan Simons, you know, who's a cognitive psychologist, will argue is that's the point. You are so busy focusing on the passes, you ignore something phenomenally obvious. And this has been used in all sorts of contexts, not least of which is, you know, airport screeners who, as they're looking for liquids and gels and discovering the shampoo that you completely forgot about or the water bottle in your handbag, what they are not noticing is guns and knives. And you can prove this over and over again. You know, you can get the guns and knives through, but you can't get the gels through because everybody's looking for the gels. If you focus on one thing, it means you don't see the other. So we think we have this phenomenal cognitive capacity where we can just do all these things simultaneously. We really can't. That's why, you're not going to like this, but I have to tell you, it's why you cannot safely drive a car while talking on your cell phone, even hands-free. The net cognitive impact of talking on a cell phone is the same as being over the alcohol limit. I won't even bother telling you what texting does. You know, you can figure that out for yourselves. Equally, missing one night's sleep reduces your cognitive capacity to the limit, to the same degree that being over the alcohol limit has. And yet, what do we do at work? We celebrate these heroes who jump on planes, fly overnight, bundle themselves into hire cars and zoom down the motorway while talking on their phones. And we think, wow, these guys are so committed, they're so energetic. Aren't they great guys? We don't celebrate drunks, but we do somehow celebrate people whose cognitive capacity is roughly the same. There are very, very hard cognitive limits to what the brain will absorb. Listening to Mozart won't expand them, or even Bach for that matter. And to the degree that we fail to respect them, all we can guarantee is that we'll miss something. And the scary part of that is we don't have any control over what we miss. When we're load balancing our brains, there's an editor taking over, but the editor doesn't have any very good instructions. So you have no control over what you miss. So poor Warren Briggs, you know, he really has no chance of doing his job well. Why is he there? Why is he there all by himself? Well, Warren Briggs is the victim of an orthodoxy. And, well, actually several orthodoxies, to be fair. And one of those was that to be a significant energy company, BP had to be big. It had to be a super major. This was John Brown's orthodoxy when he took over as chief executive, and he executed it by going around the world, buying up lots of oil and gas companies and smushing them all together into the new, big, bold, beautiful BP. So first of all, he thought the company has to be big. Secondly, he thought the successful way to do that was through mergers and acquisitions. So he loaded the company with debt, which meant that then what he had to do to please the markets was to start cutting costs. 25% every year for 3 years. So 3 big orthodoxies. And nobody apparently inside BP pointed out to him that the failure rate of M&A, depending on whose research you believe in, is roughly 50 to 80%. So we're going to follow this orthodoxy. It says you have to be big. We're going to follow the orthodoxy. It says mergers and acquisitions is a cool way to grow. and we're going to follow the orthodoxy that says you then strip costs out in order to carry your debt. The economist Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate, said, orthodoxies are like maps. And as you get more and more data, you can't put everything on the map. So you're deciding what goes in and what goes out. And in possibly the most provocative throwaway comment I have ever heard from an economist, he said, you know, I sometimes think that the data that didn't make its way into my economic models was more important than the stuff that did. That could explain a lot. But the point he's making, which is a very important one, is all orthodoxies, all mental models, tend to attract confirming data and marginalize disconfirming data. So orthodoxies edit too. Now, who's this woman? She has nothing to do with BP, but she should be much more famous than she is. This is a woman named Alice Stewart. She was a British-born physician. She was a little unconventional because she was practicing in Oxford during the Second World War and afterwards in the new emerging field of epidemiology, the study of disease. She was divorced and she had 2 kids. So all of that made her pretty unusual. Being a scientist, being a very good scientist, she really wanted to make her mark, and the way that scientists make their mark is to find a really hard problem and solve it. So the problem that Alice Stewart set herself was a really fascinating one. She wanted to understand why in post-war Britain there was an increase in the rate of childhood cancers, and in particular, why it seemed to affect well-off families more than poor families. Because in almost all disease, there's a very distinct correlation between poverty and disease. But in this case, it seemed to be upside down, which is the better off you were, the more likely it was that you might be a victim of childhood cancer. So this is a really knotty problem. She had a lot of difficulty getting funding for her research, but she eventually got £1,000. And she did, you know, what all entrepreneurial women do, which is, since she didn't have enough money to do everything herself, she just got lots and lots and lots of people around the country to help her, mostly health officers. And she gave them a survey, which she asked them to present both to families who had had children who died of childhood cancers and a control group that didn't. The problem she had, of course, was she didn't know what she's looking for. So this is a real needle in a haystack search, and she has one shot at it. So she asked every question she could think of. Did they have an indoor and outdoor bathroom? Did the kid eat sweets? Did the kid eat fish and chips? Did they ride bikes? What age did they start school? Were they a first, second, or third child? The gender of the child? All sorts of things. And as these carbon-copied surveys started to come back, one thing leapt out with enormous statistical clarity. And what that was that in the families that had had an incidence of childhood cancer, the mothers had all been x-rayed when pregnant. Alice rushed into print. People got very excited. They started talking about the Nobel Prize. She started a survey of childhood cancers in Scotland and tried to survey more of the childhood cancers in the UK because she reckoned pretty soon the data is going to disappear, the cases will disappear. Well, she really didn't need to hurry. The British medical establishment did not outlaw the X-raying of pregnant women for 25 years. A lot of people said, oh, well, that's just, Alice was difficult. You know, she is a stroppy woman, divorced, kids, unconventional. They just didn't like her. Well, you know, they always say that about women, don't they? It must be her fault, basically. Well, it doesn't really hold water because after she'd published, the Harvard School of Public Health, reading her findings, had up a very, very similar study in the US, of course a much bigger study because the US is a much bigger country. Exactly the same findings. And it took them 24 years to abandon the practice of X-raying pregnant women. So it's Alice's fault theory really doesn't work. So what was happening? You know, at this rate in England, you have 25 kids dying a week. And yet nobody's prepared to accept what Alice is saying. The problem was an orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy was what was known at the time as threshold theory. And threshold theory maintained that everything is safe up to a limit, some kind of threshold, after which it becomes dangerous. But what Alice was saying was actually, for fetuses, there is no safe level of exposure to radiation. None. And being asked to choose between the data and the orthodoxy, or the theory, or the mental model, the British medical establishment, under Sir Richard Doll, chose the orthodoxy. Now, these aren't stupid people, and they're not statistically unintelligent people. They were blinded by the theory that in other contexts had proved tremendously useful. It's just here it didn't. And we all have orthodoxies, absolutely fundamental beliefs that help us organize the world and organize our experience of the world. And they tend to attract, we tend to notice the information and the incidents and the people that support our orthodoxies. And we tend to marginalize or poo-poo anything that challenges them. So orthodoxies are very helpful, but I would argue they're also very dangerous. One of the most spectacular orthodoxies was Alan Greenspan's orthodoxy that what the world needed was more deregulation. And in the 20 years leading up to the banking collapse, you can, and I have, traced, you know, example after example after example where the unregulated derivatives market explodes. But Alan Greenspan couldn't see that because it didn't subscribe to his orthodoxy. So the key thing to remember about orthodoxies is they will seek confirmation. They're kind of like magnets that attract anything that agrees with them and repels anything that doesn't. And they do fundamentally shape our beliefs, and they determine what we are prepared to see. I'm sure you can all think of some orthodoxies in this government and the last one. What else is going on in poor Warren Briggs's life? Well, there's a lot of this stuff that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. There's a fantastic series of studies into organizational silence by a couple of American academics. And they told me this great story because I said, you know, what made you interested in this subject? I mean, it's a hard thing to study something that doesn't exist, right? Organizational silence is studying all the things that nobody's talking about. It's a little kind of hard to track. And they told me a great story. They said, well, there was a new initiative at the Stern School, which is where they teach. And everybody was talking about it in the hallways, the way you do. And we were all saying what a really terrible idea this new initiative was. And then it comes to the staff meeting, and we all come in, and it comes up on the agenda, and nobody says anything. And they left the meeting and turned to each other and said, gee, do you think that happens anywhere else? Well, of course, you know, we all know this, don't we? We all know the meetings where we go in thinking, you know, this initiative is wrong, or this person shouldn't be hired, or we shouldn't be buying this technology. And you kind of look around and you think, well, nobody else seems too worried about it. And you don't really want to stick your neck out. And so it goes through. So there's a lot of organizational silence inside BP. There are really extraordinary emails that I found from one executive to another saying, you know, we have to get together to come to a meeting to discuss what the 25% cuts are going to be this year. And obviously some people are kind of, I'm not sure about this. I don't, they're really wrestling with their consciences. And finally one guy emails to another, what part of 25% don't you understand? I don't want to come to a meeting if we're not going to get the work done. They get the work done. The argument that this could be unsafe, that this could put lives at risk, never happens. It just never happens. Now, the interesting thing about the academics who decided to study this is they started, first of all, by doing a survey of executives. And they asked them, how much, have you ever had an experience where there was something that really bugged you at work that you felt you couldn't raise? Fully 85% of them said yes. That's a lot of silence. And when I got their permission to replicate the study in the UK, the numbers were pretty remorselessly the same. There's only one big difference, which is that in the US, the reason given was fear. Fear of recrimination or fear of kind of unpopularity with colleagues. In the UK, it was futility, a sense that if I speak up, it won't make any difference. So I don't know, you can take your pick, fear or hopelessness, whatever. Fear and hopelessness keep people very, very quiet, often about exactly the things that they most need to discuss. So there's a very famous study of a bunch of nurses who are working in a hospital where there's one highly abusive nurse. She's mean to patients, she intimidates and bullies patients, to the point where she's looking after a lot of old people. They're afraid to ask for help. They're afraid to ask for a drink in the night, although dehydration is a gigantic risk in geriatric wards. They're afraid to ask to go to the bathroom, and therefore they won't drink. There's all sorts of silence going on because all the nurses know that Annie is abusive. They can see she's a bad nurse because it's a public ward, and nobody says a word. When you look at some of the care home scandals that we've seen recently, the thing that always strikes me is these are public places. There are lots of people working there. These nurses are not hidden away, and the abuse is not secret. It isn't that nobody knows what's going on. It's that everyone simply prefers to turn away. It's a gigantic, gigantic problem. Then there's another problem, which is that mostly, like the BP executives who've been told to cut 25%, mostly we do what we're told. What's really important is that we think we won't. So one of the most famous experiments in psychology was conducted by an American psychologist named Stanley Milgram, and many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this. But for those who aren't, I'll very quickly explain what happens. Milgram was a psychologist in New York in the 1960s. He was Jewish. He was very troubled by what had happened in the Holocaust, and he wanted to understand how could all of these good Germans have done such bad things. And he set up a very beautiful experiment and a very robust experiment, the findings of which have never been challenged. So in the experiment, you have a scientist over here who's the experimenter. He's somebody who has a position of authority because he set up the experiment and he's wearing a white coat. That's all. You have someone who is playing the role of a student. This person is actually an actor. But this guy doesn't know it. This guy is the volunteer. He's been offered $5 to take part, this is the 1960s, to take part in this experiment. There is no reward for continuing, and there is no punishment for stopping. And he's told it's an experiment into learning. He has to ask the student some questions. If the student gets the question right, he moves on to the next question. If the student gets the answer wrong, he delivers an electric shock. Each electric shock is progressively more powerful than the one before, going up to 450 volts, which is a lethal dose. Everyone asked by Milgram before he did this experiment, would people obey? Said no, of course not. It's wildly unethical. Nobody's going to do this. In fact, fully 65% of people went all the way. It was a result that so shocked Milgram that it took him 10 years before he published his findings. At first, people were so troubled by this, they thought, well, there must be something wrong here. There must be something wrong. It must be that this guy isn't a very good actor. And somehow, subliminally, the volunteers have picked up on this. And they kind of know it's a game, unconsciously. So some psychologists in Ohio replicated it, only this time, instead of using an actor, they used a puppy dog. And the only fix here was that the electricity wasn't as powerful as the volunteer thought it was. But nevertheless, the puppy dog did get shocked, and he obviously wasn't acting. And in that case, fully 100% of men and women went all the way. Now, this is very, very challenging stuff, because essentially what Milgram discovered is that by and large, most of us, most of the time, asked to do something by someone in a position of authority will obey. This experiment has been repeated for the last 40 years in every country in the world, and the data just doesn't vary. It isn't just Americans, it isn't just men, it isn't just women, it's human beings. We obey authority. We think we won't, but by and large we do, even when there's no reward for obedience and no punishment for refusal. And what Milgram concluded is really important. He said this wasn't an experiment into aggression or violence. He said when we join organizations, our moral focus shifts. We start thinking of good behavior in a different way. And what I think is so striking is is this thing, he says, which is, it's inevitable that this will happen. That when we move from being private individuals to members of organizations, our moral focus shifts from wanting to be good people to wanting to do good work. And the nature of the work is defined by the organization. This is something that anybody, managing anybody, needs to take seriously to heart, which is that you can ask people to do things that are desperately stupid or hopelessly wrong, and the chances are they won't say, "Are you sure?" When executives in BP were asked to keep making cuts and keep making cuts and keep making cuts worldwide, one person said, "I can't do this." One. Everybody else, they imagine, well, this is how you get on in your career. We may know it's wrong. We may harbor secret doubts, but we'll do it. Again, a very famous nurses study. There's several rules in hospitals. One is there's a whole prohibited list of drugs that you're not allowed under any circumstances to give to patients, and you must never, ever, ever take an instruction from a doctor you don't know over the telephone. And when they did the experiment, and they asked nurses, would you administer a prohibited drug as instructed by a doctor you don't know over the telephone? What do they all say? Of course we wouldn't. It's in the rules, right? When you do the experiment, 32 out of 33 nurses did. We are obedient creatures. It's in our nature. It isn't about being good people or bad people. That's what was so fundamental about Milgram's findings. This is who we are when we come together to pursue purposes greater than we could ever achieve alone. And we need to understand that if we're going to exercise our own authority with diligence and care. Now, Milgram's great teacher was a guy named Solomon Asch. And Asch did a fantastic experiment. There are certain kind of great experiments, because they're so pure. And this is one of them. Really, really simple. The question is, which line in Exhibit 2 matches the line in Exhibit 1? Okay, this is not really deeply taxing intellectual work. But the twist, of course, is Asch gathered 8 people. 7 of them he instructed to give the wrong answer. So say the answer is B. The 8th person was completely naive, innocent person giving the right answer, whatever he thought the right answer was. The question was, would the 8th person give the right answer, which is obvious, or give the wrong answer in order to go along with the crowd? And you know the answer, don't you? Most people would rather give the wrong answer than be left out. What's incredibly interesting, though, is that this very similar experiment was done 3 years ago using fMRI scanners. So people in these horrible machines, they're shown something on a screen, and their brain is being filmed while they're doing it, because what the psychologists and the neuroscientists wanted to understand was when you are in the act of conforming, is it a conscious decision or something else? And what they discovered was that the participants in the experiment, as they tried to figure out this problem and tried to decide what answer to give, the areas of the brain responsible for visual perception didn't light up at all. In other words, knowing what the crowd thought, the individual didn't even see the correct answer. We are very profoundly social beings, and we want to belong. And what we see is determined by what the people we want to belong with see. Now, what was really interesting for these psychologists is that, they started extrapolating all sorts of things about how musical taste develops. Why suddenly it is some god-awful musician will become incredibly popular. So they started thinking of all sorts of cool commercial applications of this finding. But I think what's really important for us, thinking about how this plays out in business, is that what it means is that if somebody's asking you to do something or you see something going wrong, what you're most likely to do is think about what everybody else is doing and how they're behaving. In other words, our reference point is each other. And so what that means is that if nobody else is complaining or nobody else is worried or nobody else is anxious, then we'll take from each other a sign that it must be okay. Now, it's very important to distinguish between obedience and conformity because they're similar but they're not the same. So obedience is about a formal instruction. Conformity is just totally informal. And it is, if you like, the kind of dark side of corporate culture, which is corporate cultures can make us feel great and inspired and motivated and part of a team, but they may also stop us seeing a problem because we don't want to confront the conflict that might put us outside of the group. So conformity is a very powerful, powerful influence. And most often, sometimes in the companies that have the most profound corporate cultures. I'm going to skip that for a second. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, because there are lots of other sort of drivers of willful blindness, but unquestionably money is one of them. And Nobody really knows why this is true, which is to say they've tried doing all the experiments in fMRI scanners and still nobody really understands what money does to the brain. It's just pretty clear it does something. And how do they know this? Well, again, there's some great experiments where you can get people to play Monopoly. The people who make the most amount of money, when they encounter somebody who's spilled a box full of pencils, they will spend the least amount of time helping them to clear up. There appears to be, and there are millions of funky money experiments. You can put people in front of screensavers that are images of money and then ask them for help. And they're less likely to help than people who have, flowers and bunny rabbits on their screensavers. You can't help but think when you have organizations that are completely driven by fiscal motivation, so banks with gigantic bonuses, performance-related pay, things like that, that part of what this appears to do is to undermine a sense of social connectedness. It's a very interesting study and a fantastic psychologist at the University of California in San Diego, where he studied, and some of you may be familiar with this, he studied a daycare center in Israel. And the daycare center, like all daycare centers, had a huge problem with people picking up their kids on time. Those of you with kids will know that actually this is really hard to get anywhere on time. And it was a problem because it meant teachers had to stay late, the teachers had to be paid overtime, they were annoyed, they were grumpy, so they thought, okay, we have to solve this problem. So what do we do? Well, we're going to fine the parents who are late because we need to punish them for the cost that they're incurring. So they introduced a fine, which was, I don't know, $10 a minute, something like that. A significant fine. And what happens? More parents are more late. What they interpreted was that the fine was a price. Now we can be late, we just pay our way out of trouble. But the really interesting thing was that when they realized this didn't work and they tried to undo it, they couldn't go back. They couldn't go back to the situation where their parents felt a social commitment not to keep the teacher hanging around. That they had somehow severed the social bonds and they could not be put back together again. Some psychologists who are really grappling with this argue that it's a little bit like cognitive limits. That we have kind of motivational limits. And that to the degree that we're motivated by money, we are less motivated by social connectedness. It's impossible, or, well, it may not be impossible to prove. It hasn't been proved yet. But certainly what all of the evidence of a mountain of experiments indicates is that the more people are thinking about money, the less they are thinking about each other and the social consequences of their acts. Which means we have to think about this stuff very, very, very carefully. Now, you could think, well, wow, Margaret, after you've done all this, didn't you really feel like throwing yourself off a, bridge somewhere? As I said when I started, part of my motivation was, if we understand some of these mechanisms, will that help us to understand how to counter them? So, here are a couple of things to talk about, and then we should have a discussion about it. When I went back and looked at the work of Alice Stewart, one thing that really struck me was that she had a great working relationship with a statistician named George Neal. Now, George was exactly the opposite of Alice. She was gregarious, very sociable, very jolly. George was a bit of a nerd. He preferred numbers to humans. And he loved cranking through Alice's data. But he said a very important thing. He said, my job is to prove Dr. Stewart wrong. Because if I can't do it, that's the only way she can be confident that she's right. Is that great? What a partnership. His job was to prove her wrong. And the only way George could protect her was by trying as hard as he could to figure out some other sense that this data might make. And when he couldn't do it, she could be confident she was right. That seeking of disconfirmation is incredibly important as a process when we're making hard decisions. I wonder how many business leaders have the courage to appoint people and say, your job is to prove that I'm wrong. Testing hypotheses, really important. I interviewed a fantastic, very controversial guy named Herb Meyer. Herb was second in charge of intelligence under President Reagan. And he's widely credited with being the person who first put forward the notion that maybe the Soviet Union was about to implode. And the way this worked out is a really interesting story, which he told me, which is, he said, the thing that bugged me was just that, we kept asking all the spies all the same questions, and amazingly enough, we kept getting all the same answers. And he said, I just had this feeling. We all have these feelings, right? We hardly ever go to the lakes Herb went to. Well, I had this feeling that it wasn't right. Counting the tanks in the May Day parade, it just didn't really impress me anymore. So he said, but everybody said, oh, come on, Herb, you're barking up the wrong tree. So he said, okay, let's think about it like this. Let's imagine for a second that I'm right. Let's imagine that the Soviet Union is about to implode. What would we expect to see? This is a fantastic question. If I were right, what would I expect to see? And they brainstormed all the things that they might see. And he said, okay, send that out to the spy network. And if they don't see anything, it's fine, I'm wrong. The other thing he said, which he says was fundamental to this, is he said, if they do see any of this stuff, it has to go to George in room 402. It has to go to one person. It can't go everywhere or it won't add up. Just one person. So what happens? The first piece of data that George in room 402 gets is there's a meat train somewhere in the Ukraine that the local peasantry have attacked. The army's been brought out, but then mysteriously is sent back. And they're allowed to keep the meat. This isn't what happens in healthy economies. And of course, the list that Herb had created kept getting ticked off. And George in room 402 got a fantastic data trail that added up to something that was meaningful. It's a brilliant intellectual process. If I were right, what would I expect to see? Celebrating mistakes. It really struck me when I was working on the book that we mostly don't celebrate mistakes. We try to hide them. But a good mistake is really worth its weight in gold. And I think, there are two things we tend to do in organizations. We tend to think that conflict is bad and mistakes are shameful. And I'd like you to just, consider for a second that conflict is how we make decisions. There are good ways to do conflict and there are bad ways to do conflict, but conflict contains enormous richness if we can learn to do it well. And so do mistakes. But there are very few corporate cultures that say, hey, we made a great mistake, what can we learn from it? But the cultures that do are the ones that remain less blind. Diversity, I put up there, is really important because, and I'll have to race through this because we're going to run out of time. But so one of the things I discovered, this is really strange stuff, but one of the things I discovered is we all are attracted to people like ourselves, right? People tend, for example, if you look at marriages, most people tend to marry other people who are roughly the same height, hair color, eye color, build, background, religion. Now, I know you're all going to say, oh, I married somebody completely different from me, but if you take the vast swathe of the population, most people marry people like themselves. And if you look at online dating sites, for example, like eHarmony or Match.com, what are they doing? They're doing exactly the same as Amazon's book recommendation engine, which is they're scoring people and matching people who have similar scores. There's a very good neurological reason for this, which is that the brain prioritizes information that's familiar, right? It's just like if you think of an office block in the middle of the rush hour, and the automatic barriers aren't working, so it's all down to the security guard. Who's he going to let through first? He's going to let through the people he knows. It's the newbies with pulses that he's going to take more time checking. Well, your brain's like that. Your brain is basically saying, do I know this? Yes. Whoosh, straight on through. Do I know this? No. I better think about it a little bit. It's what the economist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2 thinking. But anyway, basically what it means is anything that's familiar gets processed faster. This is really efficient. It's why every day you don't have to learn the entire English vocabulary afresh, right? You already know it. Whoosh, straight into your consciousness. Okay, well, what's most familiar to you is you. You're the person you see in the mirror every day. You're the person you know best. So anybody who's like you gets that same privilege. That's what we call bias. And that's why we tend to like people like ourselves, because from a cognitive perspective, they're just easier. They require less processing. And that's why, despite decades of diversity programs and billions of pounds spent on them, companies are still finding it so hard to hire more women, hire more minorities, hire older people, hire disabled people, because the people running these organizations primarily hire people who look just like them. When I had to got to hire my first team at the BBC, like every hiring manager in the world, I wanted to hire absolutely the best people I could find. And strange as it may seem, they all turned out to be women with liberal arts degrees who spoke several languages and had birthdays in June. It was a real shock. It's why, the Vienna Philharmonic still hasn't hired a single Asian player. Apparently they don't get the German sound. Try telling that to Yo-Yo Ma. Bias is physical. It's how neural networks are made. It's why your brain is so efficient. And so unless you work incredibly hard to fight the bias, you get lots of like-minded people. And boy, if you think conformity and obedience are risky, wait until you have lots of people who all think the same way. So diversity becomes a phenomenally important way of making sure that your organization has lots of perspectives. And unless you have lots of perspectives, your conflict isn't going to be very useful. The argument about diversity isn't just that it's fair and it's right, but it'll make you smarter. It also means, though, that we have to learn to do conflict well. And I don't think most people do. Not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how to. There are lots of sort of tips here. Mind guards. There are some business leaders who will have thinking partners who try to watch to make sure they don't fall into habitual thinking or orthodox thinking. Very often companies who are making really important strategic decisions, for the purpose of that process alone, will appoint a devil's advocate whose job it is to prove the strategy's wrong. And that's what they're rewarded for. So they're given permission to be a pain in the neck. It's also, I think, really important. I came out of this whole process thinking, actually, we all need to go on negotiation courses. And the reason I thought that is because conflict really is about negotiating information. And one of the things I've learned in the process of going around the world talking about willful blindness is that there's this incredible stalemate. So the leaders of organizations say to me, Margaret, we really want to know what's going on. We need people to tell us. If they don't tell us, we don't know. But we recognize there's always more information at the periphery than at the center. So we're completely dependent on the workforce telling us what's going on out there. And the workforce is saying, they don't want to know. You know, I'm not saying because they don't want to know. So this is a real standoff. And it's a very dangerous standoff. And so what I find myself doing increasingly is teaching these people how to position themselves so people believe that they want to know, and teaching these people how to communicate what often feels like very dangerous, risky information in a way that isn't so dangerous, isn't so risky, and can be heard and not just rejected. It's really tough. And it is extraordinary to me how profound is the belief. Monotask and sleep. I have to say all the sleep stuff and the multitasking stuff has changed the way I live now. I'm very focused on single tasks at a single time, and I'm very focused on the fact that, you know, when I don't get enough sleep, the chances are I'm doing work really badly. But the other thing I would say is that in the course of doing this research, I spent a lot of time talking to individuals who seem to me in certain circumstances to have seen much more. So I talked to people in banks who had seen the credit crunch coming, and they could document the fact that they had seen it coming years ahead of time. So this wasn't hindsight. They had documented, they had written about the dangers that they were confronting. And a lot of, so something really interesting happened. So I talked to lots of these people, and I kept trying to think, is there something they all have in common? This sort of overlapped with talking to whistleblowers, who of course are people who've seen something others haven't seen and dare to talk about it. And there's a lot of mythology around whistleblowers, all of which of course is wrong, which is they aren't mostly women. They aren't mostly outsiders. In fact, it turns out most whistleblowers are true believers. They're really, really loyal employees who just are shocked and dismayed when the information they've discovered isn't welcomed. But I think the most important thing I discovered is that when you took a big group of these people, they were really ordinary. And that may not sound like a great finding. It would be much easier if there was one extraordinary thing about them. But on the other hand, it made me think, well, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. And one of the people I interviewed along these lines was a guy named Roy Spence. Roy Spence is an advertising executive in Texas. And he's the first person who'd say to you that he's ordinary. But, you know, he's an ordinary ad guy. He's tall and he's handsome and he's charming. He's very punctilious and he's a great salesman. But Roy was one of the very few people who categorically refused to work with Enron. Now, that may not strike you as remarkable now, but, you know, in 1998, 1999, 2000, this was the 6th largest corporation in America. It was being celebrated by Fortune magazine as the greatest company in America, one of the greatest places to work, and it was celebrated at endless length by Harvard Business Review as the business model of the future. And Roy said, I'm not going to do business with you guys. So this was an extraordinary thing to do. And also, Enron was in Texas, Roy's in Texas. Of course, they should do business together. Enron had more money than God, you know. So I said to Roy, how did you know? Because let's face it, lots of really smart people didn't know. How did you know? And he gave me all kinds of slick answers. And then he said, well, maybe it's this, he said. When I was young and I was growing up, I had a sister who had cystic fibrosis. And I used to take her to school every day. She was in a wheelchair, and I'd push her to school. And I could see people looking at us and feeling sorry for us. And I used to think, you know, they have no idea what a fabulous woman she is how much creativity she has, how much richness she adds to our family life. And it left me with a question, which was, if they're missing so much about us, what am I missing about them? Is that a fantastic question? And he said, somehow, that internal dialogue is something I've never stopped having. This is what the philosopher Hannah Arendt calls thinking. Thinking without banisters. Having a critical discussion with yourself. Am I okay with this? What am I missing? What might I see if I changed my view, my perspective? And you can call me a hopeless optimist, but I kind of think, if Roy can do it, we can all do it. Thank you very much. Now, I'm very happy to take questions, comments for as long as you can stand it. So I saw lots of nodding heads, which is always really nice. And nobody stormed out in a huff. Please, come on. Somebody be brave and not silent. Yes?
How do you make people listen to you?
Sorry?
How do you make people listen to you?
Well, it often depends on the people, but it's a lot about thinking about what are their orthodoxies. What are the barriers to them hearing you? Who are your allies? What are their working styles? I once had an investor in one of my software companies in the States who was an absolute bully. It was really interesting because we'd have these weekly meetings where all the companies he'd invested in, all the CEOs would come together, and we'd exchange kind of industry news and so on. And he'd regularly tear these guys apart, because that's what bullies do. And from time to time, I would see the company, and particularly this guy, the chairman, make what I thought were really, truly stupid mistakes. And so part of what I learned from that was, you don't confront him in public. I also figured out that he was dyslexic, and that handing him a lot of pieces of paper that I expected him to read while I was sitting there was not going to work. And he is also a math whiz. And so in the end, what I did is I always confronted him in private. I always sent him the paperwork ahead of time. And I never required that he make a decision in my presence. In other words, when he backed down, nobody saw it, not even me. And that's one example of kind of learning how to negotiate the information that I had. In the courageous conversations that we're kind of practicing with people, this changes a lot according to corporate culture and the individuals concerned. But the one thing I would say is in almost every situation, checking out your perceptions with other people who will give you an honest answer, and or ensuring that you have allies is pretty fundamental. But what you don't do is jump up in public on a table and start screaming the roof down, which is what people feel they want to do. And then when they feel they can't do that, they feel they can't do anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
When we are taking decisions, like business decisions, we tend to evaluate the potential upside and the downside.
Mm-hmm.
So this blindness that you are talking about, is it like necessarily have to deal with the downside?
No, it's both.
Is it the problem areas that we get overlook, thinking more about the process?
You'll tend to overlook the stuff that you're uncomfortable with. I mean, I've seen lots of business cases where, the upside was phenomenal and the downside, was terrible. Totally loaded dice. One of the things that a lot of smart organizations do is they may ask several groups to tackle the same problem in parallel so that they get multiple solutions. Because one of the things about business is there's almost never one right answer. So they'll set the same problem for, say, 3 teams who come up with completely different solutions, and then you're contrasting solutions rather than just looking at a sort of binary yes or no answer. And it tends to surface a lot more of the complexity that's inherent in the decision.
But then you will have very few takers if you start talking about the negative side or the downside of any. Like in a business.
Yeah, but the downside is the risk.
Like in a business plan or something, we talk more about the projected profits and everything.
Mm-hmm.
We do not necessarily talk much about what is going to happen if this happens.
Right. So part of what you need to do is create an environment in which people feel very safe discussing that. I mean, I judge, lots of business plan competitions, and I look at a lot of business plans, and the one thing I can tell you, every single one gets the timing wrong. Always. Always. I mean, it may be a fabulous business, it may be a great opportunity, but the timing is always wrong. So then the question is, okay, let's imagine this is going to take 3 times longer. How do you stay alive in that period? And if I'm wrong and it only takes twice as long, you're golden. But it's really reality testing the hypotheses and taking them to extremes to see, okay, how much robustness is there in this plan? And making it safe for people to do that. Because there are always people who know. They all know that when you do a business plan, right, you're complete tunnel vision with Excel, and you're loading the dice. I mean, to a degree that's just, it's just monotonously predictable. So also the issue is, where would you rather be wrong? In the conference room or in the marketplace? So let's be wrong in the conference room, often, before we go out into the marketplace. Just a second, yeah.
I actually work in the health service.
Oh, right.
And one of the challenges, I think, is solutions. I agree with mistakes and things, but staff often feel that they're blaming the book, trying to check patients.
Right.
And what these things do. So I just find that the balance.
Yeah, so there's a fantastic story that came out in Massachusetts, which was there was a guy who was running a hospital in Boston called Beth Israel Deaconess. And he had this really dangerous idea that he was going to start publishing, this is in America, right, the land of litigation. He was going to start publishing the rates of physician-induced errors. I mean, everybody thought he was completely barking. And he said, we're going to do it for 2 reasons. I mean, this is a really challenging hypothesis. One is, I think when we fess up, we're going to have better conversations with our patients. And I'm betting, in the American health system, he was betting a lot that our litigation costs go down. And he was right. Because actually, people really are grateful when you go in and say, actually, you know what? I screwed up. I operated on your left hand, not your right hand. I left some gauze in your stomach. I mean, these things happen. They can't not happen. Everybody knows they happen. And the other bet that he had is that if he started doing it, eventually the other hospitals would have to start doing it. And not only was he right about that, but now in the state of Massachusetts, all the hospitals are legally required to publish that data, and across the board, the incidents have gone down. So what I think that shows is that actually being honest about mistakes can reduce them. But also, I wrote in my book a lot about something I'm sure you'll be familiar with, which was the horrible story at Bristol Royal Infirmary to do with pediatric cardiology, which is they had a really extravagantly dangerous surgeon who was doing heart operations on babies. And a lot of babies died. And everybody in the National Health Service knew that this was going on. And the physician, an anesthetist who finally blew the whistle on this, subsequently did a really interesting experiment where he issued his staff with PDAs. I mean, now we'd use smartphones, I guess. And he just asked them, to keep a record of what they did every day. So he was collecting mountains of data in order to be able to analyze trends. And first of all, everybody thought, oh, they won't want to do that. They'll think that you're spying on them. Well, actually, they didn't mind. And the reason they didn't mind was when they had the data, they could learn how to improve their own performance. And they started trying to do their jobs better, and they could benchmark themselves against themselves. So actually being transparent about mistakes or just underperformance improved performance. Now, I think this is all really counterintuitive, but I think it's a really important message to go out, which is when you're honest about mistakes, it's the best way to start reducing them. When you cover them up, they can just go on for years, which is what happened at Bristol. Yeah?
Is it possible to be non-conformist as well as politically correct?
I can't answer on political correctness. I'm just, I think it probably isn't possible to be completely nonconformist and function in society. I think some people are more comfortable with nonconformity than others. One of the psychologists I interviewed for my book is a really wonderful guy named Philip Zimbardo. He's famous for a thing called the Stanford Prison Experiment. But one of the things that he does in his psychology classes at Stanford is he makes people do something that he calls a deviant for a day, which is essentially to be nonconformist for a day. And it may be something, really trivial, like dressing in a strange way or wearing peculiar earrings or whatever. He said, what's really profound is that we are so driven to conform to other people's expectations of us. And it's really liberating to discover that you can tolerate not doing that. And I'm really struck, because I have 2 teenage kids, and I'm really struck by how much both in their social lives and their educational lives is all about teaching them this is the right way to do things and this is the wrong way to do things. This is the right way to write an essay or think about economics or think about history or whatever. And it's a way. And it may be the best way right now to get through your GCSEs. But it's really important that we don't forget it's not the only way. And that true education is about critical thinking and looking at an argument and not thinking that's the one I have to regurgitate, but thinking what's wrong with it? What's wrong with the argument? How could it be different? And I don't think we do enough of that. I said this to a bunch of people I was talking to at a literary festival, and one of the parents said, so you want us to argue more at home? And you could see every parent in the room just hating me. But actually, yeah, I think we need to argue more at home. I think we need to learn how to do that. And we really need our kids to learn how to do it well. Yeah?
Is there a clear distinction between willful blindness and willful denial?
And denial? Well, I think there is. I mean, undoubtedly, denial is a form of willful blindness. I wouldn't argue that at all. But I think there are 2 things. One is it's really important that this is organizational as well as individual. And I also think that we build organization with blindness built into it. So there is structural blindness. Because one of the questions I asked myself as I got to the end of the book was essentially, what are the conditions required for willful blindness to flourish or for it not to flourish? Because I do think that some of the answer to this stuff is personal, but a lot of it is structural too. And I think that there's a lot inherent in the way that we construct organizations that makes it impossible for us to see. Yeah?
Most of what you said resonates strongly with both.
I'm sorry.
It's a really good thing. I think one of the things that is more pernicious, my experience, especially nowadays, where this gentleman's point, it's common practice actually to have the discipline of listing your negatives and risks. What we don't do well is evaluate risk. We can identify that there is a risk there, but evaluating the danger is how we get around that positive mindset.
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on there. First of all, I think this binary thing is probably really misleading. So it's more helpful to think of what are the ranges of, what are the different upsides, what are the different downsides. But I think you're absolutely right about risk. And there's a really interesting guy I interviewed, a guy named Pat Lewis, who worked at Bear Stearns. And he spent 3 years designing a way of evaluating risk within the bank, and only to be told by his CEO that they weren't going to go with it. And the reason they weren't going to go with it was because it was going to create too much conflict in the organization. So, I mean, that's just an extraordinary example of choosing not to see. But I think what's really interesting about what Lewis did is, with some really interesting heuristics, he did figure out how to price the risk. The reason the CEO wouldn't go with it was because it was going to affect people's compensation, and then there'd be lots of hissy fits, and he just couldn't handle it. It is a dirty little secret of a lot of business leaders that they're terrified of conflict. So they'll make all sorts of decisions to avoid it. Yeah?
I want to find out from you the lessons that you're learning. For instance, you want to take a personal decision that has far-reaching consequences. Then you get somebody whose job is to prove you wrong. Or a corporate decision, you get people whose job is to prove the strategy wrong. If there are some decisions that you take them once in a lifetime, or you have the opportunity of taking just once. So if it is that, what useful lessons will you get if you have somebody whose job is to prove you wrong? Then number two, if you have already taken the decision, of what benefit would that personal job will serve if it's to prove you wrong? Because already you have taken the decision in any case.
Right.
So if he has even given you, if he succeeds in proving you wrong, proving you right, of what lessons will you learn?
Right. I think that's a really interesting question. Because I think everybody makes mistakes, and all organizations make mistakes. And the crucial thing is how good you are at learning from your mistakes. So you can take a decision and it turns out, that was the wrong one. But then, how do you think about what you've learned from it? One of the things that I think is very frustrating to all kinds of people at the moment is, how come we didn't learn from 2008? And we find ourselves in the same mess all over again. Well, one reason is because we didn't sit down and have that discussion about what really, truly, fundamentally went wrong. Not in any kind of courageous fashion. And if we're not prepared to have that in 2008, and we're not prepared to have it in 2011, I hate to think what 2014 is going to be like, because it sure isn't much fun now. So I think that even if you've made a decision it turns out to be wrong, there's a huge amount of learning to be gained from it. But it's better if you can do that up front, conflict, to make the decision before you've made the decision. Yeah. But, I mean, here's a very personal example. 20 years, 30 years ago, I don't know, 20 years ago. I decided to get married. I was madly in love, of course. The wonderful guy who's handsome and brilliant and fabulous. Of course. And if anybody had dared to say to me, Margaret, Michael has a congenital heart condition. This is a risky decision. I would have said, don't be ridiculous. We're in love, we're going to live forever, right? Actually, if somebody had said that to me, the conversation I could have had, and I should have had, and I wish I had had, was, What does that mean about the way you want to spend your time? What does it mean about when you want to have a family? What does it mean about your financial planning? I don't think anybody could have talked me out of marrying the guy, but I could have protected myself a lot better. So I think that, those are the fierce conversations that you need to have, and you need to find the people who are prepared to have them with you. And when you find those people, don't let them go, but change them occasionally, because otherwise they'll start agreeing with you, and then you're sunk. But there was a gentleman behind you, I think.
This might be a long answer to my question, might be too long, but can you relate this somehow to like the governments and how we as a society have seen the information through the news and through what the politicians say to us? Do you think we are ignoring what's obvious from what they're saying to us, like on a mass scale? Like, do you think there will be a big peril that will happen soon with not just UK, but every other country, from the actions of the government, such as the economic crisis and things like that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. I mean, I'm not into global predictions, really. And if you ask me what's going to happen in the world, I'll, be saying, well, I don't know. I don't feel very good about it at the moment, but I suppose nobody does.
The way that, like, people, even if they hear something bad on the news, and even if they know that's wrong, and people will still not do anything about it. Like,
actually, I think that's really interesting. I have this sort of rather rigorous belief that if you write this stuff, you kind of have to live by it. So yesterday I sat down with my husband and I said, okay, I have a theory or a hunch. Let's not make it too grand. I have a hunch that in November the banking crisis is really going to get horrible. All the heads of state or European heads of state are supposed to meet, I think, the first week in November, and if they can't figure out the default problem, the sovereign debt problem long term, we are screwed. So, let's hope it doesn't happen. That's what that's what we've all been doing, right? So, okay, so let's hope it doesn't happen, right? We've got that over with. Now, what happens if it all goes to pieces? What are we going to do? What should we be doing now that then we will say, gosh, we wish we had? And, we went through all sorts of things, Should we buy a tractor? Should we buy plant seeds? Should we have a lot of cash in the house? If the ATM sees up, do we want to have cash on hand? All kinds of, kind of crazy scenario planning, out of which emerged a lot of things which, frankly, even if the banks don't go FUT, turn out to be pretty smart. And if they do go FUT, they may give us a little edge. So I think those are good conversations to have. Now, I completely sympathize with people who think, I just don't want to know. And I have got to the point in my own household where I listen to Radio 3 because I just can't stand hearing the news anymore. And my kids have suddenly become, incredibly knowledgeable about classical music. So I do understand the ostrich mentality, and I absolutely share it. But I think, if I've learned anything writing this book, it's that we ignore the obvious because it makes us feel safer at exactly the moment that the danger is increasing. And so actually, if you want to be safe, you need to be prepared to look the danger in the face. I think it's time for a drink, don't you? Thank you all very much.